we embraced the malls and we embraced the big box stores and we embraced that because it felt like progress, right? It felt like, well, that downtown is the old and this is the new and our economy's changing and we need to change with it. But what we're really trying to get back to and what would have been before this kind of museum piece of a downtown was an actual real economic ecosystem where you had, not only offices and shops, but you had local retailers doing locally produced stuff. You could buy your clothes locally that was actually produced locally, that actually, was sourced materials locally. There's a whole like economic ecosystem that ties into a core downtown and the surrounding neighborhoods that has essentially like human life to it. We can go back and look at cities for thousands of years and we see not just restaurants and coffee shops, but we see like the things that humans actually need to survive.
He is the founder and president of Strong Towns. He also coined the term STROADs. Please welcome Chuck Marohn.
Hey, thanks so much.
Thanks for being here. Brian Semmel, our producer, did want to title you as the person who coined the term STROADs because we've been saying the word STROADs because this is a segment of the show where we get very specific about infrastructure.
Great.
Before we get to that, you have an interesting history. You are, there are a lot of people who are activists around changing the way the suburbs work, changing how we build cities, think about cities. They tend to be progressives. They tend to be liberals. You are a Republican. You started your career as an engineer. I don't know if you still consider yourself a Republican, but can you talk a little bit about, your kind of realization around sort of suburban design that led you to see it as unsustainable?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. I am a conservative guy from a conservative place. And I don't really identify as much as Republican anymore, maybe more when I started Strong Towns did. But certainly, as an engineer doing projects, building roads, streets, sewer systems, water systems, all this stuff, I was dealing in like multi-million-dollar capital investments that we were doing. And I was watching the development that was resulting from that being two things. One, not nearly enough in terms of its intensity or its value to actually, through the tax system, recoup enough money to pay for it. And I also looked at it as being very temporary. I'm only 47 years old. In my little town, I've seen the Walmart move twice now. And those buildings be abandoned afterwards. And, we spent millions of dollars to get the sewer and water out to the Walmart building. And so you look at this disproportionate level of investment, the public investment being essentially an eternal investment, a permanent, very high level of public investment, and the private investment being a very almost throwaway, like temporary, like disposable level of investment. And if that weren't bad enough, just the revenue streams themselves come nowhere near maintaining what has been built. There was a really hard realization for me because like I said, I grew up in a place that this is what we built and this is what success looked like. And so it was really hard to actually peel back the numbers and recognize that the more we did, the harder, the more of this stuff we built, the more difficult our financial situation became. And actually the more broke our city was becoming.
And so what I find interesting about sort of your perspective is I think there's a lot of partisan arguing. You see, Democrats pushing for investments in transit, in rail, in broadband and clean energy. And then there's this kind of addiction to cars on the part of Republicans. But what I find interesting about the way you look at this is that that's almost beside the point. And I think STROADs are a good way into this. So, and I think, and the reason I wanted to talk about this is because I think this is something people see all over the country all the time, and they don't have a word for it, and they know it's not right, and they don't know about how to make something better. So, what is a street? What is a road? And what is a STROAD?
It's a really foundational kind of thing. And I think when it first appeared on my pen, I was like, wow, okay, that's a novel way to describe something. A street is very clearly like, it's a platform for building a place. We talk about it in terms of finance often. So it's a platform for building wealth. But if you think of wealth as kind of a multi-dimensional thing, it's a platform for building a place people want to be. A road is a connection then between places. It's how you get from one place to another very quickly. And I like to describe a road as like a replacement of a railroad, which is a road on rails. You get on at one spot, you get off on another spot, and there's a high-speed connection between the two. We can look back in history and we can see that, roads used to be waterways. You would get on a boat at one place, and that's how you got long distances very, very quickly. But once you arrived in a place, you had a series of streets that were designed to build wealth, not for through traffic, not for, fast movement.
So so a road is like a highway, an interstate, a railroad, a river, whatever. It connects to places, and a street, like a quintessential street to your mind, is what people all claim to want to live around, be around. It's like when people talk about quaint towns, they talk about a beautiful downtown district where they can walk around and go to a restaurant and go to a store. Like that's a street, a commercial space that's a destination.
And let me parse it a little bit, because I think you're getting to the essence of it. But let's make this even clearer. A road is the economic value of a road is in connecting places, not in having development along it. Right. And the economic value of a place is about building the greatest place possible, not about having cars that can go through it very quickly or travel that can pass through it very quickly. So the two like goals, and you see this embodied in a STROAD, the street road hybrid, is something that is trying to both move people and goods and stuff quickly and create economic development. And it just fails at both. You really can't do both simultaneously.
Yeah, like you compared it to I think a futon, which is that like a futon's, it's a bad couch and it's a bad bed. So a STROAD, it is something that's trying to do both and doing both poorly. And these are places you see all over the country, which are basically like multi-lane highways off of which you can go into big giant parking lots where there's either strip malls or big box retailers or like series of giant restaurants or what have you. And they're trafficy. They're not easy to drive through. They're certainly not easy to walk through. And they're not kind of lovely places to visit. And we've built these STROADs everywhere. They're all over the country. So I want to talk about places that are kind of deconstructing these places and these spaces, these STROADs, these like bad places to visit and bad places to drive through. But okay, what were the incentives that led sort of cities and counties and municipalities all over the country to construct these kind of street road hybrids?
I love that question, because I do think that it when we look at it, you're like, why would anyone build this? And then you have to say, well, why did they build it? There were huge financial incentives to do this. When transportation funding largely comes from the state and federal government, what you see is that a lot of these places are on state aid highways, state through roads, county through roads, that they're on basically transportation funding that comes from someplace else. And so what you're doing when you can build a $200 million bypass of a city, or where you can build a $20 million frontage road thoroughfare kind of thing, what you're doing is you're tapping into outside money. And so it's in a sense like house money you're playing with, and you put it in place. And so any development that you get off of that is like free money for a local government, right? For a local government. That's the government incentive. If you look at the private sector incentive is massive. I mean, the government comes in, they build for you at no cost to you, or at very low cost to you, the Walmart, the strip mall, the McDonald's drive-through, what have you. They build this piece of infrastructure and essentially, cover all of your upfront, what in pre-Great Depression days would have been like the developer's cost. That's all covered. And even where it's not covered, the part of it, we've made that development process really cheap and easy. So we've got long-term financing for you. We've built secondary markets for that. So it is really, you can think of it as a modern equivalent of slash and burn agriculture. You just build things like pop up really quick, one life cycle, and you don't worry about the second life cycle. You just get it really, really, really quickly. And in the economic system we've set up, everyone kind of benefits from it. If you're the federal government and you measure success in terms of GDP, which is a measurement of transactions, and unemployment, this creates a lot of transactions and it lowers unemployment, in the short term. If you're the local government and you measure success in terms of the number of permits you issue and the amount of tax-based growth you had over the last year, this is like really easy to do. The problem always comes in 2, 3 decades later when you have to go out, fix and maintain this stuff. And the tax base you have is either gone or insufficient to actually do that job.
Yeah, so these spaces are ultimately unsustainable, and there's a kind of, you see this in a few different kind of forms of unsustainable building. So the life cycle, you talk about the life cycle of suburbs as being unsustainable. They are built, they flourish, and then they slowly fade away because the cost of maintaining the infrastructure, the roads, the sewage, the electric lines, all of that is too expensive in this kind of sprawl. The same thing happens with these kind of multi-lane highway, but also commercial spaces that, like, ultimately they are built to decline, right?
They are built to decline, and we can say that confidently because if you look at organic systems, you look at natural systems that sustain themselves over time, there's a certain evolutionary process, right? They adapt, they change, circumstances are different. You just go back to the roads that I built in my early engineering days, let alone, the people who taught me. It's a completely different economy today than it was back then. So we have to have systems that we build adapt and change over time. The defining feature of post-war development is that we build everything all at once and we build it to a finished state. And so everything that we build is designed to be good at the same time, fail at the same time, and then not change or adapt in any way. And that's just not, whether you're looking at it environmentally or ecologically or socially or financially, that's not a viable model.
So, and we talk a lot about how these sort of big box retailers have, like Walmart and others, have pushed out mom. There's like this debate, right? Like, oh, are they just living in the wreckage of downtowns, or are they helping to push the destruction of those downtowns? But we don't talk enough about the actual infrastructure choices and where we put dollars in the system that make it much cheaper to build a big box store and actually kind of suck money out of, the downtowns everyone talks about loving, right? The community spaces, the places where people gather and see friends and see family on the street, the quintessential version of a downtown space that people want. Are there, can you talk a little bit about places that are kind of coming back towards supporting kind of downtown development and what that looks like in terms of like how people should be pushing either locally or pushing their representatives to kind of support stronger downtowns like everybody says they want but doesn't know how to support?
Right. I think that the interesting thing to note here is that when we think of downtowns, like the quintessential downtown, I think a lot of times we think of, and I'm not saying this in a derogatory way, but we often think of like Main Street Disneyland, which was designed to be like a simulacrum, like a version of like the quintessential downtown, right? Like that's what we're plugging into. But you see like restaurants and coffee shops and bakeries and, like knickknack places. And I feel like, that is the version that we are sliding into. And I think it's a good like foothold. But what we're really trying to get back to, and what would have been before this kind of museum piece of a downtown, was an actual real economic ecosystem where you had, not only offices and shops, but you had local retailers doing locally produced stuff. You could buy your clothes locally that was actually produced locally, that actually, was sourced materials locally. There's a whole like economic ecosystem that ties into a core downtown and the surrounding neighborhoods that has essentially like human life to it. We can go back and look at cities for thousands of years and we see not just restaurants and coffee shops, but we see like the things that humans actually need to survive.
Yeah, like not just retail, basically.
Yeah.
Like actual kind of commercial life in small towns, in downtowns.
I think a lot of times we embrace the malls and we embrace the big box stores and we embrace that because it felt like progress, right? It felt like, well, that downtown is the old and this is the new and our economy's changing and we need to change with it. Okay. But we put a massive amount of subsidy into making that happen. I mean,
right,
unfathomable amounts of money into driving downtown out of business and bringing back, all this new stuff post World War II. If we want the other stuff back, there's going to have to be not only a different subsidy approach, but an actual localization of the money. And I think that's the hard thing right now. Our economy is wired to put lots and lots of money. I wrote a thing about the Cheesecake Factory and how we bailed them out in the in the pandemic. Cheesecake Factory, within 4 weeks of the pandemic started, had notified every place they were in they were not paying their rent and they were going to go bankrupt. But we put a ton of money into buying their debt and pumping them up. And I said, it's not because anyone loves the Cheesecake Factory. It's because
let's not say something we're going to regret.
There's a simple mechanism to put lots of money into the Cheesecake Factory. And it's harder, and you saw this through the PPP program and all that, it's harder to put money into that local restaurant.
So I know that you've been critical of the way in which some of these larger infrastructure proposals moving through Congress distribute the money, that it kind of follows the same pattern. Basically, localities, to the point you're making, localities will get this money. It's a use it or lose it situation. They will come up with a way to spend vast sums of money rather than doing and build new things, but rather than the kind of ground up development that is needed. What would you like to see? I mean, part of this is this is where the money is. The federal government is going to fund infrastructure. We need, as you know, part of the problem is even some of these amounts are not enough, because even in the next 10 years in which we'll spend this money, a bunch of other things will go into disrepair. We're just not keeping up with the amount of maintenance we need to do. But so what would you like to see in terms of how the federal government invests in local infrastructure to support the kind of thriving, to re-tip the scales away from big box, highway, giant parking lot development?
It's an important question, and it's a really tough answer, because what the federal government is really good at is doing things kind of at a large scale over and over again, very efficient. So building the interstate system, ridiculously efficient. We went out and within a decade transformed an entire continent around a new idea of highways. Ever since really the end of the 1960s, early 1970s, we've been pouring money into the same system. And you can look at the diminishing returns. I mean, $1 billion for an interchange that's going to increase drive times, by 15 seconds for the average commuter. These are not good investments. And so what really needs to happen is that we need to stop expanding these systems and stop trying to build these systems and actually go out and see what we can do to make better use of the investments we've already made, increase the financial productivity, actually turn those parking lots into buildings and turn those one-story buildings into two-story buildings and start thickening up neighborhoods. The problem with that approach is that the federal government does not do that well. It's not an approach that scales. It's a hyper-local, nuanced approach. And so in a world where we kind of feel compelled to spend money out of DC as opposed to kind of bottom up, what I've said is stop spending money on transportation. Just go right to just say the federal government is just going to maintain the systems the federal government has already built. And if you've got to spend money, just give cash to cities. Just give cash to and say, do something, do whatever you want with it, because what happens today is when we fund transportation programs, every answer to every problem becomes a transportation answer. We're trying to fight climate change. And so what do we get? We get the CMAQ program, which is a program to reduce congestion under the idea that, if we have fewer cars idling in traffic, it'll be fewer carbon and less carbon emitted. Well, what they do is they go out and expand highways and they expand interchanges and they build more, and then more people drive and you get more carbon. But what we've done is, because the money comes through transportation, the climate people have basically framed, or the highway people have framed their projects in terms of climate, and the climate people have framed the money in terms of highways. It's an incestuous kind of thing that really distorts policy.
We talk about the atomization in our culture through the lens of politics often, and also through the lens of social media, but not often in the lens of infrastructure and the way infrastructure shapes how we kind of engage with community, engage with the towns in which we live. There are examples of places that have basically converted their STROADs into plazas. They've converted formerly kind of dead economic zones for basically you drive in, like, you drive in, you fill your car, you drive home, into more kind of community spaces. Can you talk a little bit about that? And what do you kind of think, what do you think it foretells for some of the changes we need to make?
I think the most exciting places right now in this country also tend to be the poorest places. And these are places, and I'll point to Memphis, Tennessee. I'll point to Shreveport, Louisiana. I'll point to Santa Ana, California, places that we've spent time in as an organization. Places without a lot of money and a lot of resources have basically gone in and said, how do we make the best use of what we have? And what you see is kind of I'm going to say a bottom up, a kind of less pretty, less refined version of what you see in some very rich places where they've gone in and built the plaza and done the very high end thing. To me, those feel often like, again, kind of like museum pieces, like kind of lifestyle appendages to a place. Mm-hmm. But if you go to some of these poor places, Detroit is another example where a lot of neighborhoods are coming back and these gathering spaces are being created. I'm not going to say people live in like some left, right, blue, red utopia. But what you do see is, I think you see a lot less dysfunction in terms of people conversing with each other, being part of each other's lives. I think you see a lot of kind of just the natural mixing of humanity that humans are wired to do. And I'll say this: you started out this program saying, that I'm a Republican and what have you. I think one of the things that Strong Towns has taught me is that there's a huge ton of value in progressive perspectives, particularly at the local level. And I can have really great conversations about conservative values and conservative approaches that line up with progressive values and progressive approaches once we're talking about our block, our neighborhood, our city, our community, in ways that cross all the boundaries that we're struggling to cross today.
Chuck Marohn, it was so good to talk to you. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. Really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for the invitation. Nice to see you.